My sister humiliated me in front of our entire family at Thanksgiving dinner. She laughed at my small apartment, my old car, my simple life. Everyone at that table looked at me with pity. But 6 months later, when the banks came knocking and her perfect life crumbled, she showed up at my door crying. The same sister who mocked me was now begging me for help. What I told her that night changed everything between us forever. This is that story. I still remember the exact moment my sister decided I was beneath her, and it happened on a cold November evening when our entire family gathered at our parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner and the smell of roasted turkey filled every room and everyone was laughing and sharing stories, and I felt happy just being there with the people I loved most in this world. But my sister Lisa had other plans for that evening because she had just closed on her brand new 4-bedroom house in the nicest neighborhood in our city, and she could not stop talking about it, and every conversation somehow circled back to her beautiful hardwood floors or her stunning kitchen island or her massive backyard where she planned to host summer parties. And I listened quietly while eating my mashed potatoes because I was genuinely happy for her success since she had worked hard as a corporate lawyer and she deserved nice things. But then something shifted in the room when my mother innocently asked me how my apartment was doing, and before I could even open my mouth to respond, Lisa let out this little laugh that made everyone look at her, and she said, "Oh mom, please do not get him started on that tiny place he calls home." And I felt my face get hot, but I stayed calm and smiled and said, "Actually I really love my apartment because it has everything I need and the rent is affordable and I can save money every month." But Lisa was not finished with me because she leaned back in her chair with that signature smirk she had perfected since childhood and said the words that would haunt our relationship for years to come, and she said, "You cannot keep renting forever, you know." And the whole table went silent, and I saw my father look down at his plate, and my mother nervously reached for her wine glass, and my brother-in-law suddenly found his phone very interesting. And I realized in that moment that Lisa was not just making a comment, she was making a statement about my entire life and my worth as a person and my place. The silence at that dinner table lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity, and I could feel everyone waiting to see how I would respond to my sister's direct attack on my lifestyle and my choices. And I had two options in that moment because I could either shrink down and let her words define me, or I could stand up for myself in a way that was honest and true. And I chose the second option because I was tired of being the quiet one who never defended himself. And I set down my fork very slowly and looked directly into my sister's eyes, and I said, "At least I am not drowning in a mortgage I cannot afford." And the room somehow got even quieter, and Lisa's face changed from smug satisfaction to genuine shock because nobody ever talked back to her, especially not me, the little brother who always kept the peace and always avoided conflict and always let her win every argument just to maintain family harmony. But something inside me had finally broken, and I continued speaking because the words were flowing now like water from a broken dam, and I said, "At least I do not need mom and dad to co-sign everything I purchase." And I saw my father shift uncomfortably in his seat because we all knew the truth that Lisa's down payment had come partially from our parents' retirement savings and that her perfect life was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. And Lisa tried to interrupt me, but I held up my hand and kept going, and I said, "At least my peace of mind is not tied to a property I am one missed payment away from losing." And the table erupted into awkward coughs and nervous movements, and my mother tried to change the subject to dessert, but the damage was already done, and Lisa looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes, and I knew that I had just started a war I was not sure I could win. After that Thanksgiving dinner, everything changed between me and my sister, and the family dynamic shifted in ways nobody expected because Lisa stopped calling me and stopped including me in group texts and stopped acknowledging my existence at family gatherings. And my parents tried to play peacemaker, but Lisa was stubborn and proud, and she could hold a grudge longer than anyone I had ever known. And months passed with complete silence between us, and I tried to reach out a few times with simple text messages saying I was sorry for embarrassing her and that I loved her and wanted to repair our relationship, but she never responded. And eventually I stopped trying because you cannot force someone to forgive you, and you cannot make someone love you if they have decided you are their enemy. And during this time I focused on my own life and my own goals, and I continued living in my modest apartment that Lisa had mocked so viciously, and I continued driving my old reliable car that got me everywhere I needed to go, and I continued saving money every single month because I had learned from watching others that financial freedom was more important than appearing wealthy. And I watched from a distance as Lisa's life seemed to get bigger and more impressive because she bought a luxury car and took expensive vacations and wore designer clothes and posted everything on social media for everyone to admire. And our mutual friends would sometimes ask me why I could not be more like my successful sister, and those comments stung, but I held on to my principles because I knew something they did not know, and I knew that appearances could be deceiving and that the biggest houses often contained the emptiest bank accounts and the flashiest cars often came with the heaviest debts. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner I received a phone call that would change everything, and it came late on a Tuesday night when I was already in bed reading a book and trying to fall asleep, and I saw my mother's name on the caller ID, and my heart immediately started racing because my mother never called this late unless something was seriously wrong. And I answered with a shaky voice asking if everything was okay, and my mother was crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying, and through her sobs I managed to piece together the devastating news, and she told me that Lisa's husband had lost his job 3 months ago, but they had hidden it from everyone and they had been living off credit cards and borrowed money trying to maintain their lifestyle and pretending everything was fine, and now the credit card companies were calling constantly and the mortgage company had sent warning letters and they were facing foreclosure on their beautiful 4-bedroom house in the nicest neighborhood. And my mother asked me if I could help, and I sat in my small apartment in complete shock because this was the same sister who had humiliated me and mocked my choices and made me feel worthless, and now she was drowning. I needed a lifeline, and I told my mother I needed time to think, and she begged me to call Lisa because Lisa was too proud to call me herself, and I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling for hours trying to process everything I had just learned and trying to figure out what I should do next. I did not sleep at all that night because my mind kept replaying every interaction I had ever had with my sister and every cruel comment she had made about my life, and every time she had looked at me with disappointment or pity or disgust. And part of me felt vindicated because everything I had warned about at that dinner table had come true, and her perfect life built on debt and appearances had crumbled just like I predicted, and there was a small dark part of me that wanted to call her and throw her words back in her face and ask her how that mortgage was working out for her now, but that dark part was not who I really was. And as the sun started rising through my apartment window, I realized that revenge would not make me feel better, and watching my sister suffer would not heal the wounds she had caused. And I thought about our childhood when we were best friends who shared everything and protected each other from bullies and dreamed about our futures together, and I remembered how she used to hold my hand when I was scared, and how she taught me to ride a bike, and how she stayed up all night with me when our grandfather died, and somewhere along the way we had lost that connection, and money and status and competition had poisoned something that used to be pure. And I made a decision that morning that surprised even myself, and I decided to reach out to my sister, not to gloat but to help, because family was more important than being right and love was stronger than pride. I texted Lisa that morning with a simple message that said, I heard what happened and I am here if you need me, and I did not expect a response because she had ignored every message I had sent for 6 months, but to my surprise my phone rang within minutes, and when I answered I heard something I had never heard before in my entire life, and it was the sound of my strong, confident, powerful sister completely breaking down and crying so hard she could barely breathe, and between sobs she apologized for everything she had said at Thanksgiving, and for ignoring me, and for being so arrogant, and for looking down on my life choices. And I listened without interrupting because she needed to release all of this pain that had been building inside her, and she told me the full story of how everything fell apart, and how her husband had hidden the job loss because he was ashamed, and how they had been pretending to be fine while secretly drowning, and how she had been so focused on appearing successful that she forgot to actually be successful. And she said the bank was giving them 30 days to catch up on their mortgage or they would begin foreclosure proceedings, and she did not know what to do, and she had nowhere else to turn. And for the first time in years my sister was being completely vulnerable and honest with me, and something shifted between us in that moment, and I told her to come over to my apartment, and she laughed through her tears and said, that tiny place you call home? And I laughed though and said, yes, that tiny place where the rent is affordable and I have savings in the bank. Lisa showed up at my apartment door looking like a completely different person than the confident woman who had mocked me 6 months earlier, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she was wearing old sweatpants instead of her usual designer outfits, and her hair was messy and unwashed, and she looked small and fragile and utterly defeated. And I hugged her for the first time in over a year, and we stood in my doorway holding each other while she cried into my shoulder, and I led her to my small couch and made her a cup of tea, and we sat together in the apartment she had once ridiculed, and I asked her to tell me everything from the beginning, and she explained that her husband had worked in a tech company that had massive layoffs, and he was too proud to file for unemployment and too proud to tell anyone, and he had convinced himself he would find a new job quickly, but months passed and nothing worked out, and meanwhile the bills kept coming and the mortgage payments kept demanding to be paid, and they used credit cards to cover everything thinking it was temporary, and now they owed over $50,000 in credit card debt, plus they were 4 months behind on their mortgage, and their savings was completely gone. And I listened carefully and asked questions and wrote down numbers and started to form a plan in my mind, because this was something I understood and this was something I could help with. I spent the next week diving deep into my sister's financial situation, and what I discovered was worse than I expected, because they had been living a complete fantasy funded entirely by debt, and their monthly expenses were almost double their income even when her husband was employed, and they had car payments on 2 luxury vehicles and subscriptions to everything imaginable, and they ate out almost every night, and they bought new clothes every week, and they took vacations they could not afford, and they had created a lifestyle that required constant income just to maintain, and now that income had stopped but the lifestyle expectations remained. And I sat Lisa down and showed her the numbers and explained that even if her husband found a job tomorrow, they would still be in serious trouble because their spending habits were fundamentally broken. And she started to get defensive at first because nobody likes to hear that their entire life has been built on sand, but I stayed calm and kept showing her the math, and eventually she saw the truth, and she broke down again and asked me how I had known and how I had seen this coming when nobody else did. And I explained that I had watched so many people in our generation fall into this trap of appearing wealthy while actually being broke, and I had made a conscious decision years ago to live below my means and save aggressively and avoid debt at all costs. And she asked me if I could teach her everything I knew. I spent the next week diving deep into my sister's financial situation, and what I discovered was worse than I expected because they had been living a complete fantasy funded entirely by debt, and their monthly expenses were almost double their income even when her husband was employed, and they had car payments on 2 luxury vehicles and subscriptions to everything imaginable, and they ate out almost every night, and they bought new clothes every week, and they took vacations they could not afford, and they had created a lifestyle that required constant income just to maintain, and now that income had stopped but the lifestyle expectations remained, and I sat Lisa down and showed her the numbers and explained that even if her husband found a job tomorrow, they would still be in serious trouble because their spending habits were fundamentally broken, and she started to get defensive at first because nobody likes to hear that their entire life has been built on sand, but I stayed calm and kept showing her the math, and eventually she saw the truth and she broke down again and asked me how I had known and how I had seen this coming when nobody else did, and I explained that I had watched so many people in our generation fall into this trap of appearing wealthy while actually being broke, and I had made a conscious decision years ago to live below my means and save aggressively and avoid debt at all costs, and she asked me if I could teach her everything I knew. 3 months into this journey, something unexpected happened, and it happened at another family dinner, this time at Easter, and everyone was gathered around the same table where Lisa had humiliated me, and I could tell she was nervous because this was her first time seeing the extended family since her financial collapse, and some relatives had heard rumors and were whispering, and I saw Lisa shrinking into herself, and I recognized that feeling because it was the same feeling I had experienced at Thanksgiving when she had mocked my apartment, and I made a decision in that moment to protect my sister the same way she used to protect me when we were kids, and when an aunt made a snide comment about hearing Lisa had some money troubles, I spoke up and said actually Lisa is doing amazing and she is making incredibly smart financial decisions and she is on track to be debt-free within 2 years, and I saw Lisa look at me with surprise and gratitude, and then our mother started talking about how proud she was of both of her children, and the conversation shifted and the whispers stopped, and after dinner Lisa pulled me aside and hugged me and said thank you for having my back, and I said that is what siblings are supposed to do. A year passed since that Thanksgiving dinner when Lisa had smirked at me and told me I could not keep renting forever, and so much had changed in that year that it felt like a lifetime, and Lisa and her husband had successfully avoided foreclosure and were catching up on their mortgage payments, and their credit card debt was down by 60%, and they had built a small emergency fund, and they had completely transformed their relationship with money, and what surprised me even more was how our relationship had transformed as well, because we talked almost every day now and we shared everything with each other, and the competition and judgment that had poisoned us for years was completely gone, and we had both learned important lessons from this experience, and Lisa learned that appearances mean nothing and financial security means everything, and I learned that being right is less important than being kind, and that helping family even when they hurt you is what love really looks like. And our parents noticed the change, and they were happier than I had ever seen them because their 2 children were finally friends again and the family was whole again, and sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what really matters. One evening Lisa called me with excitement in her voice and told me she had been thinking about everything I had taught her and she wanted to help others avoid the mistakes she had made, and she asked if I would help her start a blog or a YouTube channel about financial recovery, and I thought it was a brilliant idea because her story was powerful and authentic and could genuinely help people who were struggling, and we spent weeks planning and creating content, and she shared her journey with complete honesty, including the embarrassing parts and the shameful parts and the parts where she had been arrogant and wrong, and the response was overwhelming because so many people related to her experience and so many people had also built lives on debt and appearances and were drowning in silence, and Lisa became passionate about this mission and she poured herself into helping others, and I watched my sister become someone I admired deeply, and I realized that her worst moment had become the catalyst for her best transformation. 8-19-80. 2 years after that original Thanksgiving dinner, Lisa invited me over to her house for a small celebration, and when I arrived I saw that the house looked different because they had sold many things and simplified their lives, but what remained felt intentional and meaningful, and she handed me a letter and told me to read it, and the letter was from their mortgage company confirming that they had officially caught up on all missed payments and were now in good standing, and I hugged her and congratulated her, and she cried happy tears for the first time in a long time, and we sat on her back porch and talked about everything we had been through, and she told me she was grateful for that terrible Thanksgiving dinner because it was the moment I finally stood up for myself, and it planted a seed in her mind that maybe she was wrong and maybe her path was not the only path, and I told her I was grateful too because her crisis gave us the opportunity to rebuild our relationship into something stronger than it had ever been. Lisa asked me that evening if I had any regrets about the way I had responded to her at that Thanksgiving dinner, and I thought about it carefully before answering, and I said yes, I had one regret, and she looked worried and asked what it was, and I said I regretted waiting so long to speak up because if I had been honest about my concerns earlier maybe I could have helped her before things got so bad, and I had stayed silent for years while watching her spiral into debt because I did not want to cause a conflict, and that silence was not love, and that silence was cowardice disguised as politeness, and she nodded and said she understood because she had also stayed silent about many things, and we both agreed that real love requires honest conversations even when those conversations are uncomfortable, and we promised each other that moving forward we would always speak truth to each other with kindness, and we would never let pride or fear prevent us from helping each other 3 years have passed since that Thanksgiving dinner when my sister smirked and told me I could not keep renting forever, and today I am writing this story from my apartment. Yes, the same small apartment that started all of this, and I still live here by choice because I love the simplicity and the freedom and the peace of mind that comes with low expenses and healthy savings. And Lisa still lives in her house, but now she actually owns it because they are on track to pay off the mortgage 10 years early, and she drives a used car and shops at thrift stores and cooks dinner at home, and she has never been happier, and our relationship is the best it has ever been, and we talk almost every day and we support each other through everything. And what started as the worst moment in our sibling relationship became the foundation for the best chapter yet. And I share this story because I know many of you are in similar situations where family members judge your choices or where you feel pressure to appear successful even when you cannot afford it. And I want you to know that your worth is not determined by what you own, and your value is not measured by your possessions. And sometimes the person who looks like they are losing is actually winning. And sometimes the person who looks like they are winning is actually drowning. And choose financial peace over financial performance, and choose authenticity over appearances, and choose family over pride, because at the end of the day the only things that truly matter are the people who love you and the freedom to live life on your own terms. Sometimes, the real victory is not letting yourself lose, even if the other person wins with a laugh. If you've ever felt something like this, please let me know in the comments. I read every comment. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Don't forget to share it with someone close to you, they might need to hear it too. And if you want to hear more such real stories, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.